Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I see the 8:45 crowd meandering in, and so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for being here. And as they make their way in, you all are familiar with our schedule, but we are so glad to continue our faith talks today, and with our covenant scholar in residence, Brennan Breed. Many of you are familiar with Brennan by this point, but we are so thankful for his presence and sharing your giftedness with us and your knowledge and your love for Scripture as well as your love for learning. It's really a delight and it's contagious here, and we're very, very grateful. For those who have yet to meet Brennan, he joins us from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, where he is an assistant professor of Old Testament. We're pleased to have him on the third Sunday of every month. It's really nice of you to come all the way here and do this in person, and adds a liveliness and a personal dimension to it. And it's wonderful to be able to forge a relationship with you at this time. There will be a time, as is our custom, for question and answer at the end. And so I invite you to take any notes and ask any questions, and then they will be collected by Grace near the end of our time. We'll leave about 15 minutes for question and answer, and we invite you to participate in that as well. There's a little bit of celebration in Brennan's life going on these days. He just turned in a new child, and that new child is a book on third century literature, apocalyptic literature, and she turned in the manuscript for that to his publisher, and so we celebrate that. You can go back to being just normal busy as a professor and guest lecturer instead of writing a book busy, and we know the great effort that it took to do that, and really appreciate the understanding it will bring as we seek to understand Scripture. So will you please join me in a word of prayer as we begin our time together? Gracious God, we thank you for the gift of this gorgeous day, for the privilege of this time together, for the gift of knowledge and insight and how it shapes our lives so that we might be faithful disciples of yours. We pray that you would grant us grace and strength as we learn and grow and study together. In Christ we pray. Amen. Brennan, thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning. Well, thanks for having me here again. I really appreciate being invited to come not just once, but a few times this fall to get to know you all better and to continue maybe a kind of extended conversation. So there might be some information coming out about some other opportunities to engage each other next month. And so keep your eye out for that. I'll kick us off. So this is part of our series really that's based on the Shema. The Shema, that word Shema means to hear or to listen in Hebrew. The form there, Shema, means listen up or hear. It's like a command, an imperative. And it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, which this is a prayer that many Jews will say when waking up, many Jews will say when going to bed. This is perhaps like the kind of core content, you might say, of the Jewish faith. And it goes like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord alone. You might have heard the Lord is one. The word there actually is one, echad. In Hebrew, that's Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai echad. Echad means one, but here grammatically, it probably best is translated alone. That is to say, the Lord alone is God. So this name that I'm saying, the Lord, you might see it translated in the Old Testament as the Lord, all caps. Sometimes when Lord is just like in regular lowercase letters, that would mean an actual word meaning like Lord, like master or someone who is in charge, boss, something like that. But that word that's there, YHWH, that's what they call the tetragrammaton, the name of God, the special name of the God of Israel in the Old Testament. Probably pronounced something like Yahweh, but we don't actually know exactly. But in any event, just to say that it's a name that's being said there whenever you see Lord in all caps. It's often not translated out of reverence. Part of the Jewish faith is to not pronounce that name. There's no injunction for Christians to not pronounce the name, but just to say, I usually write it as like that to kind of signal this is a name that Jews would avoid today. So instead they'll say Hashem, the name, or they'll say sometimes Adonai, the Lord. But in any event, I'll say that this is a claim that this one particular God is our God, and that God is our God alone. This is continues to a phrase that we all know very well, that Jesus quotes as well. You shall love the Lord your God, or love Yahweh your God, love Hashem, the name your God, with all your heart. Last time we talked about this word, I'll come back to this, but this word heart, lave in Hebrew, and then with all your soul, that Hebrew word nefesh, and then with all your might, and that's ma'od in Hebrew. This translation is a little tricky. We talked about this last time, just to bring us back up to speed a little bit. That Shema, to listen or to hear, in Hebrew, it's got some more more depth to it. So if I say to my kids, "Hey, listen to this," I might put on a song or something, and they might half listen or half not listen. Shema in Hebrew, this word to listen in Hebrew, to hear, it really also means to listen and to like really seriously pay attention and to do the thing that I'm asking you to do. It's much deeper, richer, we might say, than the verb to listen in English. Sorry, just got a little something in my throat. But yeah, so this verb really means like to hear and to really do, really to think about this. And you shall love the Lord your God. You shall love the Lord your God. So listen up, Israel, or listen up, folks. You shall love Yahweh your God. And I say Yahweh there to make this is a particular, very specific name for a God. And in the ancient world, lots of people thought that there were lots of gods out there, even in Israel. Lots of the ancient Israelites thought there were other gods out there. We know because the Bible tells us they thought this. They say things about it. They talk about this from time to time. So this is a very specific, directed form of attention to this one particular God, Yahweh. And you shall love Yahweh. We talked about love last time, that love doesn't just mean or doesn't even primarily mean emotions. Today, I might say, I love ice cream. They wouldn't really say that in ancient Israel. This word is very different. It actually connotes a really deep connection, really a commitment of faith, a commitment of not just faith in a mindset, but a whole life stance. So you would love your partner. You would also love an ally. You would sign a peace treaty, like let's say with another country, and then you'd say, I love you now. Now, those two kings that signed a peace treaty might hate each other. They were just fighting each other, but they just came up with an agreement. They would literally say, I love you now. Again, it had very little to do with kind of how they felt about each other personally. It had to do with their stance towards each other. Now they were allies. They used to be fighting, now they were allies. When people got married, they would say, I love you. That would have some emotional content to it, but more primarily, it was about actually that you were dedicated to this other person with your whole life. So it was a deeper, richer word than we might think of when we think about, I don't know, I love ice cream. Or sometimes when people say, I love you, they really mean, oh, you give my heart flutters. It's very little of that is happening in the Hebrew. Yahweh might not give your heart flutters, but you are committed to this one God. Again, this was unusual because in the ancient world, there were lots of gods assumed to be out there. So devoting yourself to one God was a highly unusual act, a countercultural thing. Other peoples had lots of gods that they worshiped, and they could always worship one more. But in ancient Israel, the idea was that you are devoting yourself to this one and only one God because this one and only one God has a different way of relating to the world than all those other gods and is going to ask you to be a different kind of person. So that idea that you shall love the Yahweh, this one particular God, with all your heart. We talked last time about theological anthropology or cultural anthropology. So basically, how do different cultures think about the human body? Now, we come up with metaphors all the time. I had butterflies on my stomach. You know, we all know you don't actually have butterflies in your stomach, but it feels kind of like that. So we have these metaphors for what our body parts do. And we sometimes think about them acting on their own. So I was head over heels. No, you actually weren't, but you felt like you were flipping around. I guess things got turned upside down for you. So metaphorically, in ancient Israel, they didn't think that the heart was the center of emotions. Primarily, they talked about your kidney, your liver, your guts. Your guts were actually, those words in Hebrew meant your emotions. Your heart was primarily your thought. So in ancient Israel and in ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, they didn't think your brain did very much. They thought it was cotton stuffing holding up your head. But they really, and then the Egyptians would embalm the important parts of your body to save it in the afterlife if you were very wealthy. But like Pharaoh, they would embalm Pharaoh's heart, but they wouldn't embalm Pharaoh's brain. They would throw it away because they thought it was nothing. It was worthless. You didn't need that in the afterlife. And they thought the heart was actually the center of thought. Primarily, it's about thought. It's about what you think, about what you care about what you're devoted to. And it also involves some emotions. But like I said, primarily they thought emotions was about your gut. So when it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, this is very little to do with like how you feel about God from day to day. Make sure that you feel good about God all the time. Actually, as we'll see today, part of our lesson is you don't have to feel good about God all the time. In fact, you can be pretty mad at God, just like those kings that loved each other, with their whole hearts, they might actually hate each other, but they are devoted to each other and they are devoted to being allied to each other. So when we talk about the heart, love the Lord your God with all your heart. In an ancient world, they thought emotions, some of your emotions come, but more of like your cognitive emotions, not just raw, like how you feel, more like how you feel as you think about something. But so it does involve your thoughts, your emotions, but also they knew that the heart was a physical thing. It pumped, you need it for your life. But they also thought that your heart had to do with your choices. So when Pharaoh's heart hardens, it has little to do with his emotions, how he feels about ancient Israel or how he feels about their God, Yahweh. It has more to do with him being stubborn. His heart hardens. Like he won't make other choices. He won't let them go. He's resolved to keep them there. So if we think about loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, a big part of that really is how we think and then how we structure our lives. Like, who are we really committed to? That's the big question there. One of the things we know also about the heart in ancient Hebrew is that it is the site of our greatest failures. It's one other thing. The first time that heart shows up in the Bible, it doesn't show up in Genesis 1 through 5. It does show up in Genesis 6. It shows up right before the flood story. It shows up when God looks down and sees, says God, Yahweh, the Lord, saw that the wickedness of humans was great on the earth and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Tell us how you really feel, God, right? Yeah, God's pretty upset. Every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So everyone is just bad. Now, what does God decide to do? God decides to keep one good person and this one good person's good family and then get rid of all the bad people. Have you ever thought about this? Wouldn't this church be better if you could just get rid of all the bad people and just keep the good ones, or this denomination or this city, right? Just get rid of the bad people in Charlotte, keep the good ones, and then everything's great, right? Your organization, your business, maybe your family, just get this person out, my crazy uncle, get that person to leave, and then, everything will be great. We all have these thoughts from time to time. Let's just get rid of the bad ones and keep the good ones. The interesting thing I think about the flood story in Genesis is not that it works, it's that it doesn't work. So God actually does this flood, right? And then keeps Noah. And what's the first thing that Noah does? Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and then something weird happens with like his nakedness and his kid. Something weird goes on. It's actually unclear what happens in the story, but something's bad. But God actually says, you know what? I see now that I can't just get rid of the bad ones and keep the good ones. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great author from Russia, once wrote, the line between good and evil does not run between different types of people. It runs through every human heart. So God seems to recognize this, and God says after the flood, God says, God didn't change humans. They're just as bad as they were before. God changes at the end of the flood story. Genesis 8:21. After the flood, God says, you know what? I'll never again curse the ground because of the humans. I'm never going to destroy the earth again. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. Now, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the flood story. Beginning of the flood story says, God said, every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So again, the thoughts of their hearts, this is really kind of their primary, their cognitive stuff, right? So their hearts. First time heart shows up, God's like, I'm mad at their hearts because they're always choosing bad stuff. And then at the end of the flood story, God says, yeah, they just are going to choose bad stuff. And you know what? I'm going to accept that. And at the end of the flood story, God actually takes a new tack. God takes a new direction. God says instead, I'm not going to get rid of the bad people and keep the good ones. Instead, I'm going to deal with the bad people. And I'm not going to deal with them all the earth at once, like I tried to do in the flood story, or like I tried to do at the Tower of Babel, right? And a little after this. But God says, I'm not going to do that stuff anymore. I'm going to pick one family. I'm going to love them, even though they are knuckleheads. And I'm going to love them and try to transform them into the kind of people who can then be transforming love to the rest of the world. And so this is Genesis 12, where God says to Abram and Sarah, I'm going to pick you to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And as I've told you before a couple times, God brings them to Sinai and they make a pact at Sinai, this covenant, this agreement, a deal, right? A business alliance. And God says, here's the contract. I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people and you're going to turn into a priestly people among all the peoples of the world. So you're going to mediate the blessings of God to the world and you're going to try to help with this heart stuff, this heart problem. I'm going to love you so much, even though you're knuckleheads, that you will turn into the kind of people over time who will then eventually love others. and then eventually other people will catch on. And in the story of the Bible, this is what Jesus is. Jesus is the point where this catches on to the other peoples, right? Jesus is the not a new covenant exactly. He doesn't get rid of the old covenant. Jesus is like this law is going to stay, right? But what I'm going to do that's different is I'm going to open up the doors so that other peoples can come in, not just this one family. So now we're invited into this family who's going to learn how to help with this heart problem. So people in ancient Israel knew that they had a problem with their hearts. They knew that they had a problem of their thoughts, but also some of their emotions, but also the way that they structured their lives, right? What they devoted themselves to. We hear from David, right? In Psalm 51, create in me a clean heart, oh God. This isn't just, again, emotions, right? And this is like, fix the stuff that's going on in my brain that's wrong and help me to become a different kind of person. Help me to renew myself, right? So we hear this kind of also from the prophets. The prophets, this is Jeremiah. God says, I'm going to put my law inside them. And this is in Jeremiah 31. I mentioned this last time, but this is the new covenant. Jeremiah and Ezekiel both mention that there will be a new covenant. And this new covenant is that God is going to put the law directly in people's hearts, and they're just going to live it out. They're going to live love for each other and for the world. The problem, of course, is that this hasn't happened yet. Jesus talks about this at the table when Jesus picks up the cup. He says, this is the cup of the new covenant. Now, that's a foretaste of the new covenant. Jesus didn't bring this, right? You don't have the law living in your heart and you do the right thing all the time, right? Part of Jeremiah 31 is that you don't have to teach anyone anything anymore because everyone's going to know exactly how to live. That didn't happen. Hasn't happened yet, and I think it won't happen in my lifetime, right? So I'm going to be a knucklehead my whole life. But nonetheless, I know that God has chosen to love me. So what Jesus is bringing is a way for us to hope that there is going to be someday a fulfillment of God's love fully in our hearts and in our minds, and that we will live this out. Probably not in our lifetimes. Again, Jesus opens up the door for us to join this community that is being formed. So that book of Deuteronomy, where that comes from, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. Deuteronomy is interesting because a lot of the other books of the Old Testament don't talk about loving God. Deuteronomy is the book that says you need to love God with your whole heart. And other books later that refer to Deuteronomy, like Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet who loves the book of Deuteronomy. He quotes it all the time. He likes it a lot more than he likes Genesis. Jeremiah never once mentions the creation stories in Genesis. He doesn't talk about the flood story. He doesn't talk about any of this. He doesn't talk about Genesis very much at all. He loves Deuteronomy. So that's to say that there are some folks that are formed by the rhetoric, the way that Deuteronomy teaches. And Deuteronomy is a book about teaching, as we'll see in a minute. So Deuteronomy chapter 4, this is right before chapter 6, right? So chapter 6 is that Shema. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. Chapter 5, just before that, is the 10 Commandments. Moses gives again the 10 Commandments. And before that, chapters 1 through 4 of Deuteronomy, Moses is telling the story of how everyone got to where they are. Now, why does Moses need to do this, right? Remember where Moses dies. He dies on the edge of the promised land. So Moses takes the people out of Egypt through God's power, brings them to Sinai. They get the new law, they get the covenant, and then they proceed into the wilderness, and then they get the 40 years in the wilderness of wandering around, where God really kind of helps them become a new kind of people. And then they come to the edge of the promised land. They're on what's called the plains of Moab, this area that's overlooking the land that they will go into. And Moses gives this new law. He gives the new law. Deuteronomy means second law. Now, they got the law back at Sinai, but he's telling them about it again, and he's kind of preaching 5 sermons. Really, Deuteronomy is 5 sermons. It's a five sermon series, 3 points each. But really, he's given the sermon series to the new generation. The older generation has passed away in the wilderness. The new generation is on the verge of coming into the land. So they were not at Sinai. They were born in the wilderness, all these people. So they were not at Sinai. They were not in Egypt. They do not know Pharaoh. Right? All they know is the wilderness, and they are the ones who are going to start this new people. And so Moses preaches Deuteronomy, these 5 sermons, in order to prepare them to become the people who are going to start this new community in the land. So Deuteronomy 4, again, this is kind of the end of his story. Deuteronomy 1 through 4 is the story of how they got here. And then Deuteronomy 5 is the 10 Commandments. And then Deuteronomy 6, really 6 through 11, is a sermon about the first commandment. And so you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. So like devotion to God, that's really the first covenant. You shall love the Lord your God, and this is the idea. You worship Yahweh alone. That's the name of the game. So in Deuteronomy 4, Moses is setting this up, and he's transitioning really from his story of how they got here. You came out of Egypt, you were enslaved, Yahweh freed you, brought you to the mountain, and now we're coming into the land. And chapter 4 is a wonderful sermon, lots of great theology here. And part of it near the end, Moses says, you will seek Yahweh your God and you will find him. If you search after him with all your heart, that's lave, again, mind really, and then soul. It's translated as soul often in modern English translations. This word nephesh in Hebrew actually means throat. So whenever you see throat, a soul in the Old Testament, that's really throat. So they didn't actually think you had like a little tiny thing inside you that you kind of imagine what a soul, like a ghost you or a tiny ghost you or something. They did not imagine that. That's a Greek idea. It came long after the Israelites wrote, this long after the time of Moses. Moses knows nothing about this idea of a tiny angel ghost you inside of you, right? That like when you die, it like flies away. They don't think that. Moses, if you read the whole Old Testament, Moses keeps talking about how you just go down to Sheol. All the people, David says, when you die, you just go to the underworld and you just kind of sit there. They don't think very much about an afterlife in the Old Testament. This is a thing that evolves over time in ancient Israel. They come to realize that there's more to the story than our lives. But at the time of Moses, they're not talking about this. You just don't find it. You might remember in the New Testament, there's the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the two groups that fight. And the Sadducees are the ones that keep saying, there's no afterlife. There's no afterlife. And they fight with Jesus about this. And Jesus sides with the Pharisees who say that there is an afterlife. The Sadducees are the priests. And they don't believe there's an afterlife because they only read the Torah. They only read Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's their book. They don't like the prophets. They don't like, they read Deuteronomy and they say there's no afterlife mentioned here. It's just about this life. So all to say that this idea that there's a soul, what that word really means is your throat. That literally means throat in Hebrew. Like if you have a sore throat, you'd say my nephesh hurts. So this really means throat. It can mean kind of metaphorically your whole self, your whole life, because you breathe through your throat. It's the place of breath. And you eat and you drink, it sustains your life. So it becomes like a metaphor for your whole life, your whole self. But it doesn't mean a ghost you who lives on after you're dead, your body dies, right? Like John Brown's body's in the grave, but he goes marching on, right? They don't think that. So this idea of soul, when you see that in the Old Testament, really it's the self, your whole self. So search after God with all of your heart, your mind, right? And all of your self, your whole self needs to seek after God. So this idea from Moses is that it's possible for us to know God, even in the midst of our heart problems, if we try to devote ourselves. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. That means try to find God everywhere all the time. Keep God on the forefront of your mind, might be another way to say this. Practice the presence of God, right? God's here. What is God doing? What's God up to? Have a conversation with God in your head all the time. Have an actual relationship with God. Now, this is an unusual thing to say in the ancient world about a high God. In the ancient world, everyone else thinks that there's lots of gods out there, some very powerful who created the universe and the cosmos, and some who are not so powerful. They think there's a hierarchy of gods, just like people. There are some people who are not so powerful, and there's some people who are super powerful. Now, if you try to go talk to super powerful people, is this easy or hard? It's really hard, right? I mean, yeah, like try to get on, the governor of North Carolina's schedule. Yeah, right. Not going to happen, right? You got to know someone. You got to know someone who's going to be able to like help you navigate the corridors of power and like try to get on the schedule somehow. And you might get bumped a couple times because you're not so important. That is to say, getting on the high god's schedule was understood to be really hard in the ancient world. They thought the gods had limited amounts of time. So think about the myths about Zeus, right? Zeus like spends his day doing what he wants to do and has appointments with people and does things and doesn't know everything, right? So they think the gods are limited. So in the ancient world, people in Babylon, people in Egypt, people in Canaan, people that Moses had dealt with, all of them think that the gods have a hierarchy. There are some that are powerful, some that are not. And the high gods who created the world, the really important ones, they don't have time for you. If you want to have a relationship, it's got to be with a low-class God. It's got to be with like a much less powerful God, a God of the family. They used to call these. In Genesis, they talk a little bit like this about Yahweh, that God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, these clan leaders, the family leaders, other people who heard them talk about their God like that would have said, oh yeah, you've got a low-class God, a God of some free random people who wandered in a land that wasn't theirs, right? I mean, that's not a powerful God, right? So, but this idea in ancient Israel is, oh no, actually, that's the God who created the universe, and that God actually loves our family, like cares about our family. We can talk to this God. Like you can have time to talk to and like the attention, the focus of the actual God of the universe. And this was thought to be just mind-boggling, an explosive moment. So you can actually find God and talk to God, but you have to actually care. That's the catch. And you got to be devoted. This is what this means. You actually have to be fully devoted to this God and have no other gods. Money, power, right? I mean, like you can't want these. If you want these other things, that's going to get in the way. It's going to break the relationship up. Just like if you have a partner that you love a lot, but you actually love something else or someone else more than them, it's going to break up that relationship. It's going to make it really hard for you to have a really devoted relationship. So God says, same way. We made a covenant. They would have thought of this in terms of a marriage. Like, you got to talk to me. You got to be talking to me all the time. You got to love me, right? So if you search after God with all your heart and all of yourself, then you can actually talk to God. Amazing. But that's the point. The point's relationship. The point isn't your salvation. Sorry. The point of all this stuff is not to get you into heaven so you can, like, I don't know, like play. I really like that show, the Good Place. It's great, wonderful, and like lots of great ethical. But at the end of the show, sorry to spoil it if you want to know the end of the show and haven't seen it, maybe plug your ears. But at the end of the show, they kind of all get sick of the afterlife. Like they're in heaven, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, but like they just kind of get tired of it. And the reason they get tired of it is because like they think of the afterlife as just like playing video games. Literally, a guy plays video games until he gets sick of them. He's like, well, what am I going to do now? Or they like eat, like all the food that they want to eat, and they're like, now what do I do? Or they, I don't know, whatever. Like just to say that thinking of like, oh gosh, I'm doing this so I can get saved, so I can go to heaven and have fun all the time. That wasn't what these people were thinking about. It's about a relationship, a direct, real relationship with the God of the universe. And that doesn't get boring, apparently, according to Moses. But you got to actually think about this as a relationship instead of trying to get out of hell, right? They aren't thinking about that here, at least. So Moses also says in that same speech, he says, take care and watch yourselves closely. This is the NRSV translation. That word yourselves is nephesh. That's your soul. Like, this is what that, your whole self. Take care and watch your soul closely. That doesn't make sense, but watch yourselves closely. Like actually pay attention to what you're doing so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen nor let them slip from your mind. And that's that word lave, meaning heart. So a lot of times when you read the word mind in the Old Testament in English, that's translating that word that we sometimes translate heart, because they don't have a word for mind, they just have a word for heart, and that really means mind. So take care, watch your throat closely, yourself closely, so that you don't forget these things, and so they don't slip out of your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. The big thing that Moses says over and over again in Deuteronomy is, you want this relationship? The first step to it, which might be counterintuitive, is you have to remind yourself of the story the whole time. So we might take our parents for granted, or our children for granted, or our friends for granted. But every once in a while, you remember the story. Something happened, that moment you met, or the first time that you saw them, or when they were born, or like that moment where your parent did something for you that changed your life. So these relationships that we have, we often like forget about important moments in them. And what Moses keeps saying is you need to keep on the forefront of your mind the story. That story is crucial and that's really important. That's going to actually direct your heart the right way. To remind yourself to be grateful. Really, it's about gratitude. To be grateful for what God has done for you. So I don't know your story. I know some of your stories, but I don't know all your stories. But knowing that moment, what actually happened? Now, Christians sometimes share their story, right? The story of how they came to faith or how faith became important to them, et cetera. Their testimony, we call this their witness. Sometimes this can be done for manipulative reasons to share your testimony so you can try to like force other people to do things. But at the same time, this is actually an important practice that ancient Israel tells us to do. Remember this story and tell your kids about it and tell your kids' kids about it. And then Moses moves into the Ten Commandments. And this is really interesting because the Ten Commandments, these folks who are present at Moses's gathering, right? They're about to go into the land. This is the new generation. They were not at Sinai. They were not born yet. Moses says, Yahweh our God made a covenant or a deal, a contract, a marriage with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors, not with our fathers and mothers did Yahweh make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. Yahweh spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the fire. And then it says, and Yahweh said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. It goes into the 10 Commandments. Now, what's unusual about this statement, what's weird about this is that it's a lie. It's not true. Their parents were the ones who were there. It says your ancestors were not there. It was you who heard the fire. And those kids must have been going, Moses, are you okay? Are you slipping a bit, right? Is this a problem? Do you need to take a few minutes? We were not there. Our parents were the ones who were there. You knew them. But Moses is trying to say something, I think. This verse, Deuteronomy 5:3, is one of my favorite verses in the Bible because it's so strange. It doesn't make any sense, but there's something that happens in Hebrew in this verse. It piles up, and the translations often make things smooth out really nicely. Like, for example, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Or it's the kind of New Testament when Jesus quotes it. But this word in Hebrew, your might, that word actually in Hebrew means very. So in the Hebrew, it really says you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your self and all your very much, which doesn't make sense. But the point is that Moses is trying to say something that doesn't make sense. He wants to actually surprise you. And here he's doing the same thing, but we make it sound really nice in Hebrew. In English. In Hebrew, it's shocking. Yahweh our God made a covenant with us at Horeb, not with our ancestors did Yahweh make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. In Hebrew, it's like us, the ones who are here, the ones now here alive. Us. Yahweh spoke with you face to face out of the fire. These words I've bolded there: our God, with us, our this, us, all of us here alive today. Especially that phrase there, all of us here alive today. In Hebrew, it's not grammatical. It doesn't make sense. Moses is trying to point to it. Think about this. And he's using these words that are called deictics or shifters. Deictics means to point in Greek. These are pointer words. This, us, here, today, now, the ones who are alive now. This is a really interesting question. Might sound pedantic, but if you were to define the word this for the dictionary, what would you say? What does this mean? Or how about this one? What does the word here mean if you were to put it in a dictionary? Now, if you define Charlotte, that's easy to define. You can give a latitude, a longitude, but the word here. Now, if I use the word here and I mean Charlotte, I might mean something later this afternoon when I'm back in Decatur and I say here and I mean Decatur or my house, or do I mean covenant when I say here? Notice that this word doesn't mean anything. It only means something the moment that someone speaks it out loud, and then it only means that for a little bit. And then it has to go away because someone else has to use that word to mean something else. The word us, who is us? Who do I mean by us? Well, whoever I mean at the moment I say it. And you mean it differently the moment that you say it. Or the word today. What day is today? Well, it's the day that anyone who says the word today at the time that they say it. Or now. Well, it's the time that someone says the word now. This is why these words are called deictics. They point to something in the real world, or shifters, because they shift meaning all the time. And Moses piles up these words in this, and he's saying, you were there. Your parents weren't there. So the folks who hear these words, when I read them out loud, Yahweh our God made a covenant with us at Horeb, not with our ancestors did Yahweh make this covenant, but with us, all of us who are here alive today. It's kind of neat. It's a neat trick of writing, because at the time that Moses is saying it, he means the new generation. And he wants the new generation to live into this story. It's their story now. It doesn't matter what happened to their parents exactly, but they have to make this their own. That's why he's retelling the law. He gives them a second law, a deuteronomos. That's Deuteronomy. This is second law exists because they have to live this thing in their own way. But then also every generation who picks this thing up, it's not about our ancestors. This covenant is for us, the ones who are here today. And when we're gone, There's going to be another group that picks this up and they're going to say, it's actually about us. We all inherit this story. This is our story. And it's not someone else's story. This is your story. And you've got to live into it. And we got to make it our own in some way. Deuteronomy does not say the same thing that Exodus does. Deuteronomy retells the 10 Commandments and Moses changes them. I don't know if you've noticed this. Deuteronomy 5 gives the 10 Commandments and they're different than the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. There's not huge differences, but there's differences. And they reflect the context of the people. They're about to come into a land. Exodus was given to them in the wilderness. They didn't own anything. There's a different reason for the Sabbath commandment. There's a different structure to ownership and possession because now they can own houses. There's a different relationship to women because the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers changed the way that the community thought about women. So all to say that there's changes that have happened in the meantime, and Moses is reflecting that. And in the same way that task faces us. Jesus did this when Jesus said, "You've heard it said, now I say unto you." He wasn't like doing something different than Moses did. He was doing the same thing Moses did. That is to say, trying to help people live this story, this exact story, but in their own day and in their own time, in a way that's faithful to them and their relationship to God. I'm sorry, this is that deictics, kind of pointing stuff. I, here, now, yesterday, today, tomorrow, there, here. All that stuff doesn't actually mean anything unless you say it the moment that you say it. So saying the story out loud is the big important point. We got to say it over and over again to our children, to ourselves. We got to understand who we are in the midst of all of this. And after this is Deuteronomy 6, right after the 10 Commandments are spoken again. And this is the part that we remember or recognize. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. This is when this occurs in the midst of all of this, right? Right after Moses is saying, you got to actually live this relationship with God. Now you shall love or be devoted to Yahweh your God with all your heart and all yourself and all your might, all your strength. All these words that I command today shall be in your heart. That is in your mind. You got to think about this stuff. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You should talk to them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. You got to talk about this stuff all the time. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. You've seen perhaps Jews wear tefillin, these kind of little Jewish it's a practice of like wrapping the text onto your arm as you pray, like little leather straps. Or they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You might have seen Jewish folks in prayer who bind literally a little box to their head. It's got the Shema in there. It's got some of the Torah kind of on their head. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house. These are mezuzah or mezuzot. You might have seen these on Jewish homes you walk into. They'll have a little bit of like a little metal panel that has some Torah on a scroll written inside there, and it has the Shema. You shall, hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God. So you shall put this stuff all over the place. And when Yahweh your God brings you into the land that God swore to your ancestors, take care that you do not forget. Don't forget Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, these people weren't in Egypt. This is the generation that was not enslaved. However, they got to keep remembering that story. That's their story. And that's what keeps them, motivates them. And there might be a time to come that a kid says, "Hey, why are we doing all this stuff? What's the meaning of these rules?" And then you say to your kid, "Hey, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt." And Yahweh, now this person who's saying this in this story was not actually there, right? But you have to say, we were there. And Yahweh brought us out with a mighty hand and showed us signs and wonders, great and grievous against Egypt and Pharaoh and all his household before. And God brought us out from there. That is to say, living that story is really important. And remembering it as your story. This is our story. Now, there's another aspect. Good, I got a few minutes. Okay. There's another aspect to this, and that is we actually also have to tell our own story that we've lived. So we have, right? This is our story. Yes. But there's also the part that makes it ours. Like that is to say, like the individual story that I've gone through. And the Bible talks about this too. Now, remember I said, love the Lord your God doesn't mean you have to feel nice, flowery thoughts about God. Well, the Bible shows us this very much so in the Psalms. The Psalms are the part of the Bible that helps us to talk back to God. Some people call it a script. When you don't know what to say, the Psalms offer you a script. You might have read through the Psalms and said, "Oh, I know this one. It's beautiful. This one is troubling." You might have gotten to a part of a Psalm and you said, "We read the first part of this in the church service, but we did not read the second part of this because it gets pretty weird. It gets brutal. It gets angry. It gets defensive. I mean, there's like you're calling for curses on people. What's going on in the Psalms?" John Calvin, wonderful theologian, right, said that the Psalms, and this is in his commentary to the Psalms, they are an anatomy of the human soul. What the Psalms do is they lay bare the human soul in all of its beauty and disgustingness. So in the same way that you've watched like maybe you've seen like you've been flipping channels, you see like one of those surgery shows on TV, and like they're showing a surgery, and you're like, oh gosh, like, the human body is weird, right? We've got this weird stuff going on inside of us, and but all that stuff matters, right? We need it. It's functional. In the same way, the anatomy of the human soul, like our thought world, our life, internal life, is kind of strange, and there are some things in there that we might not want to show other folks. And yet, God made all this stuff for us, even our anger, even our hurt. God made all of that, and there are proper ways to use it and improper ways to use it. And the proper way to use it is to talk to God about it. So, speaking from the heart, right, really is in the Bible demonstrated for us. Like, how do you love the Lord your God with all your heart? Well, if you only say nice things to God, God, I love you, you're so great, you might not actually love God, because loving God means showing God your whole self. If you have a spouse, if you have a child, if you have a parent, and you do not actually speak honestly to that person, that probably is because you don't have trust. Like, you actually don't trust them. And we all have relationships that lack trust in our lives, and we know that we hide ourselves in those spaces. When you actually trust someone, you can actually talk to them honestly, and you can say the hard thing. You can say the thing that makes you feel uncomfortable about yourself. And you know that they're going to love you and they're going to be devoted to you. They might be hurt. They might be angry. It's not about their emotions, but in the long run, they love you and they can handle it. And in the same way, if you only ever say to God, you're wonderful, you're great, I'm terrible, I'm a loser, this might not be a true self that you're giving to God. It might not be speaking truly from your heart. You shall know the Lord your God, Moses said in Deuteronomy 4:29, when you seek with all your heart, your whole self, whoever you are, what you feel. Shakespeare and King Lear, speak what you feel, not what you ought to say. I think it's great advice. Frederick Buechner quoted that talking about prayer, and I think it's great advice. Speak what you feel, not what you ought to say. God really wants to hear it. You don't need to say everything that you feel to your neighbor, but you don't need to say everything you feel to your pastor. But say everything that you feel to God, and God can handle it. There's a little example of this. And this is in 2004, this guy, Frank Warren, distributed 3,000 postcards around Seattle, I think, and just asked people to send him their secrets anonymously. And he started to post some of them, and he calls it Post Secret. And some of these are someone writing, I still feel like a failure, graduated from, I don't know where they're in the Army or they're in the Navy, but they still feel like a failure even though they've achieved something. Or someone says, I was too cool to hang out with my dad. I never knew it'd be my last chance. Now, these are anonymous. These people are just telling someone, the air in general, how they feel. And someone else says, I'm so afraid of failing, I don't even want to try. Or, no one knows what a struggle it's been lately, but I held on for one more day. When people started to talk about this, Frank Warren started to ask people how they felt when they saw their own anonymous post be posted up there. And he started to ask other people who didn't post this, what did you feel? He started to get lots of feedback about this, which is to say people felt freed by being able to share their secret. They felt freed as well when they saw someone else who had the same secret as them, and it was shared kind of publicly, but also anonymously. There's a part of the Anglican liturgy that says, "God from whom no secrets are hid." I really love that. We need to admit that God knows everything about us, but also not to say that, well, then I don't need to say it to God. But in fact, having a true relationship means to say these things to God, to speak out loud what we feel. And so we get the Psalms that share bitter loss. We get prophets like Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, who cries and yells at God and says to God, you lied to me. You're a liar. Jeremiah says that in chapter 15. Jeremiah 15 says, God, you lied to me. You're a liar. Because that's how he felt. And God, instead of throwing a lightning bolt, God says, okay, thanks for sharing how you feel. And then God says, let's restart this relationship again. So that is to say that we don't get a sense in the Bible that it's wrong to be mad at God. It's wrong to be upset even at your neighbor. It's wrong to feel anger, even sometimes hatred. It's wrong to act destructively because of that. But in fact, sharing those things with God in particular is actually a sign that you love God with your whole heart, your whole self, your whole might. I'll click through this really quickly, but this is just a way of thinking about the Psalms. There's basically three types of Psalms. When you open up the Psalter, when you don't know what to say, look for a Psalm that tries to help you say what you need to say. Even if it's hate, if it's anger, if it's rage, like there are Psalms like that for you that are there. You can flip through and find what do I need to say? And this can help me say it. There are three main kinds of Psalms. Hymns, these are the ones we read in church that are nice and pretty and happy. Like, hey, everything's great. This is wonderful. And they are wonderful, but they are for those points. And they're for a certain point in our life, a certain point in our life where we're happy and everything's going great. We also have laments. That's for when things are going poorly, when things are bad. And the laments, there's only this is there are more laments than any other kind of psalm in the Psalter. That is to say, God knows that life is hard and gives you resources to deal with that in the Psalms. It's also why it's like you're flipping through and you're like, gosh, a lot of these are sad. Well, life can be like that, right? These laments also do not lean into asking for forgiveness. Now, we tend to start when we think things are bad by saying, I probably did this, I probably caused it. The evil in the human heart is there continually. I know. God knows that. At the same time, the lament Psalms, only 7 out of 51 mention sin. So creating me a clean heart, oh God, that's one of them, Psalm 51. We read that a lot as Christians, but most of the lament Psalms do not say this. In fact, most of them say something like, don't you dare punish me. I don't deserve it. Not that that's right, but it's what we feel often in those times of like, I don't deserve what's happening to me. And you know what? You probably don't. A lot of the things that happen to us, we actually don't deserve. It's chaos in the world from sin, but it's not your fault. Like if you have a debilitating disease, that's you probably didn't do anything to deserve it, and it doesn't help you to think you did. Your friend who's suffering from cancer, this is not their fault. They didn't do this to themselves. This is a thing that's happening to them, and it's okay to feel angry about it. It's okay to actually express rage about this, and God gives us tools for this. So that lament psalms, most of those lament psalms are full of anger. And then we have Thanksgiving psalms. So you get through the chaos, you get through this time of disorientation, and then you want to say something, thanks God. And my important point here is that all these psalms of Thanksgiving, they share something about the story. They all retell the story of when things got bad and then God helped us and it got better. These moments in our life, these genres or types of psalms help us to actually live into that relationship with God when things are good, when things are bad, and then when things have gotten better. And then, of course, after things have gotten better, they're going to get bad again. Sorry, y'all. That's life, right? Yeah, this is the roller coaster of life. Things will always kind of get disoriented, and then we'll feel okay after a little while, and then something else is going to come up. And these psalms help us on this roller coaster of life. Sorry, but this is what we're all on. We're riding this. But being honest and faithful in our relationship, being faithful to God really means to be honest with God, wherever we are. And like Moses says, if you seek God with your whole heart, if you speak from your heart what you really feel and not what you ought to say, what you're really thinking, that in a way is when you're going to find God. That's what I have to say. I'm going to take a minute for questions, comments, or anything. Grace, yeah.
Thank you, Brennan.
Yeah.
First, let's thank you. Thank you, Brennan.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. One of, I think, the most beautiful things about this time is time to interact with you. I know that people are kind of banging on the door trying to hang out with you after church or in other places, and we are working on some opportunities for that. But I'd love to welcome questions, and I'll start with a question that somebody over there was sharing with me. You talked about the Hebrew word for soul, nephesh, being throat, and there wasn't yet this understanding of soul. And we've been also reading from Mark 12, where Jesus quotes or talks about the Shema.
Yeah.
And you talked about the Greek understanding shifting later.
Yes.
Could you speak maybe a little bit about what that Greek understanding of soul was and how those two might compare? And then after that, if you have questions, you can hand them to me or we can ask them into the microphone.
Great. So the Greek understanding of soul, which comes about much later than Moses, so like 500 years, 600 years after Moses, the Greeks start to have this idea, and it really comes from like there's a whole bunch of kind of cultural reasons people point to, but there starts to be this philosophy that emerges, right? That starts to think about the human body and the human self in certain ways. And some folks, this comes about primarily through geometry and the study of math. They start to think about ideals. Are there ideal things in the universe, like the ideal circle that doesn't exist in the real world? And so there's some philosophers like Plato who start to say, well, maybe the ideal world is that one way out there, and it's perfect things. And this world is kind of always imperfect. Like this lectern has like a little notch right here. Someone kind of hit it right there, right? It's not perfect. So this mortal world that we live in, this world of stuff, material stuff, is like always compromised. It's always, there's no perfect circles, right? Everything's got a flaw in it. And so some of these Greek thinkers started to say, there's got to be some perfect world out there. And this is like a shadow of that. We live in the shadow world. The material world is a shadow of the perfect ideal world. And that ideal world is immaterial. It's not real stuff. And humans, as opposed to a lot of other animals, can think about that ideal world. We can think about the perfect circle that doesn't exist in the real world, but like my dog can't. So humans have this thing in us that connects us to this ideal world that's not stuff, it's not material. And we can think about it and talk about it. So thinking in my inner self is connecting me to a world of ideas that is actually the true real world, but it's immaterial. It's not the stuff of this world, because the stuff of this world is always going to decompose. Everything falls apart over a given time. So that's the good world. That's the true world. That's the real world. And so then Greek thinking starts to say that we've got this psyche, soul, this little thing, and they picture it as like a little tiny you with wings that lives inside of you that is not material. It's not made of stuff. It's the part of you that thinks, that like, actually like this part of you that like can create things. It can make stuff up. It can make paintings that don't exist in the world, right? You can build things that don't exist except for in your mind. So you can start to like bring the ideal world into the real world. And this is what they start to say is your soul. And you might, if you read the Old Testament thinking about this, you'd be like, yeah, they're not talking about that. Like that, the idea that there's this like little tiny you that is not material, that's not real. They're not thinking that. But by the time of Jesus, Greeks take over this part of the world, Egypt, all the way to Babylon, including Israel, after Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great comes, he brings Greek language, he brings Greek schools, he starts to instruct people, kind of, in kind of being Greek, especially elite folks. They build these gymnasia, these like places to work out, but also to learn how to be Greek. So folks end up learning Greek stuff, Greek thought, Greek philosophy, and it takes a little while, but they eventually kind of become Greekish. And even there's this like reaction against being Greek in some Jewish texts, but they're mostly written in Greek. The New Testament's written in Greek. That is to say, like they do become Greek. So Jews by the time of Jesus were definitely like in the Greek world. They also, again, had some ways that they pushed back against it. And there was a big fight in Jewish culture about like how much of this Greek thought is real or true or good. Is the material world bad or good? This is an ongoing fight at the time of Jesus. Jesus seems to say, actually, the real world is super good. There's bad stuff in it. Bad things happen. There's pain, there's suffering, but actually the material world is super important. And Jews who follow Jesus were so excited about the physical resurrection of the body of Jesus. That was such a big deal, not because it was like icing on the cake. Jesus was like alive somewhere else, but they said, actually, there's no true real life without your body. So the early Christians make a firm, solid commitment following with Jesus to say, you are not primarily a little tiny angel with wings that is immaterial and like the real world somewhere else. No, this is the real world. This is the real you that's been created. And if you want to have a life after this, it's got to involve this stuff somehow. Jesus has the wounds still in his body to show that his flesh is real and it matters and it's important. So when we think about the world that we live in, it's not like a paper cup that we're going to throw away and then go to the real world after this. But in fact, we need to actually care about what happens around us. As Revelation says, it's going to be a renewal of this world when Jesus returns, not a different one. So sorry, I thought that's kind of a lot there. But
I'm
just
more than grateful for that response. I don't know about you guys. That was fantastic. Thank you. We have, I think, time for one or two more questions. I see them back here. Kayla, do you want to? Is it Kayla? You've got your hand up. Yeah, come on up.
Hi, Kayla.
You so much for the knowledge that you've been sharing. Do you have, because I heard you last time and this time, and it gave me a very different viewpoint of my relationship with God. And so it felt more intimate. So I wish that I could like take a class with you, but if we can't,
Columbia Theological Seminary.
Right,
Yeah.
but until that time,
Yeah, yeah.
do you have, because I feel like I've tried to read the Bible before, but most of the stuff is not accessible, like if you didn't go to school.
Right.
So do you have resources that would like, that is just for regular people to really learn the Bible and to, yeah, so that you would recommend?
Great question. And I'll mention a couple of things here, but why don't I write out something, just kind of some recommendations for folks in kind of some different like levels of intensity and like, how much people want to do, but also just some different introductions. If you were interested in this today, a book that you might appreciate is by Ellen Davis, who's at Duke Divinity School, and the book's called Getting Involved with God. Getting Involved with God. It's readable, accessible, and it'll go into a little bit more depth about lament psalms and relationship with God and being real with God in a way that might be helpful. But I can send out some like a PDF at some point with some other resources and other suggestions that might be helpful. But yeah, I mean, there's even some introductory textbooks to the Bible that I think are actually pretty good. So anyway, yeah, I can send those out later. But thanks. Does that help? Great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question, Kayla.
Yeah.
Hannah, I think we have time for one more question. Let me point it to you.
So I really appreciate what you said about like the importance of like Moses, using these passages, saying them out loud, making it your own story. Someone who grew up Southern Baptist, the Southern Baptists fear liturgy, I think,
Yeah,
except for the
yeah.
Apostles' Creed. But I think they're like, I feel like growing up, and still now we have a huge fear of just going through the motions.
Right.
Like, oh, you're saying these things, but you're just going through the motions. Was that like addressed or a fear in, ancient Israel when Moses was giving all this liturgy out and all these traditions and days of remembrance?
Great question. And yes, in fact. So a big part about, oh yeah, thanks, Getting Involved with God, Ellen Davis, excellent. Yeah, so a big part of worship in the ancient world was understood to be trying to get the gods on your side, butter them up. So what were sacrifices in the ancient world? We actually think it's a rich and deep, kind of mysterious thing that goes back as far as humans go. Humans, when they ate animals, tended to build altars and arrange human bones. So that is to say that like animal bones, I mean, on the altar. That is to say, like there was some sort of kind of giving thanks. It was a big part of this. But at the time of ancient Israel, the time of Moses, sacrifice tended to be the idea that you were giving the gods food to try to make sure that the world kept working right. It's kind of, again, buttering them up, like making them feel good about you. When they thought they were demons, they would literally feed them. They would like send like goats out into the wilderness and be like, don't eat us, eat these things. So that was the basic idea of like liturgy, was trying to make sure the gods were okay with you. In ancient Babylon, the blood of the animals was put on the altar, but also on like the entrance to the temples to try to keep the demons out. So like this will happen to you. It's like a warning. This will happen to you if you come here. Like the gods will kill you. So that is to say, a lot of the ritual was really about trying to like make our lives better, kind of optimize. It's like using tech to optimize your life. Like that's what they're trying to do in the ancient world with a lot of worship and sacrifice. And there are a lot of Israelites who thought that this is what the point was too. And the prophets get really mad at them about this. The prophets, when you read the prophets saying, "Hey, God doesn't need your animals." So the Old Testament says very clearly, God doesn't eat the food. God doesn't like the food. So what happens with the food in Leviticus? Like you bring the animal, you sacrifice the animal, you put it on the altar. By the way, the altar is a big, barbecue grill with literally a grill on top and then coals. They talk about this. And like you cut up the lamb and you butcher it, you slaughter, and then you like arrange it. You put some salt on it, right? Literally, you're cooking the food, and God doesn't eat it. God likes the smell. It says God likes barbecues, but God doesn't eat the food. What happens with the food is that you eat it, the person who brought it, and the priest, and then the person that you've offended. You kind of have this like reconciliation meal. That is to say that like ancient Israel takes the liturgies of the peoples kind of around them, from whom Israel came, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Canaanites, but then puts a spin on it. And the spin really is like, this isn't to butter up God, or this isn't about God. This is about you and about real things that happen in your life. And when ancient Israel thinks that they're going to pay off God or something, so Micah 6:8, right? Just to use a famous example. So Micah 6:8, a lot of people would know. This is maybe the only verse most people who read Micah would know from Micah. Although I think Micah's a great book. So Micah 6:8, God has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Well, this comes at the end of chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. where God says, hear what Yahweh says, rise and plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Hear your mountains, the lawsuit of the Lord. So God is suing the people. And especially it says the leaders of the people. God has a controversy and it's going to contend with the leaders of the people because according to Micah chapters 1-3, what happened is that the leaders of the people took the land from the people who couldn't resist them. So the kings took land from poor people and took away their inheritance. And God says, now I'm going to sue you for this. This is breach of contract. The covenant is a contract. So God can sue, you can sue God. In the Psalms, they literally sue God for breach of contract several times. God, you said you'd love me. You said you'd care for me. You're not caring for me. I'm going to sue you. So here God sues the people and God says, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? I brought you up from the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of slavery. I sent you leaders like Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. What am I supposed to do? You're supposed to care for the poor. I told you this. And then the people respond in verse 6, with what shall I come before the Lord? How shall I bow myself before God on high? Shall I come with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? So you get sued, and then they're like, how much can I buy my way out of this with 10,000 rivers of oil? How about, can I give my firstborn for my transgression? Shall I give the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? What if I kill my kid? Is that okay? Is that sacrifice good enough? And then God responds, or actually the prophet responds kind of on, the prophet's like God's lawyer. God told you what to do. God doesn't want your rivers of oil that you stole from the poor people anyway. You're not going to buy your way out of this. God doesn't want you to kill your kids. God wants you to do justice, love kindness. So that is to say, the prophets often say liturgy doesn't get you out. It's not a get out of jail free card. It doesn't do anything for you. They don't say don't do it. They say it's wonderful to express your true self to God through prayer and song. That's wonderful. But at the same time, when people do it for the purpose of getting out of jail free, or undoing transgression and sin, and this is a really, really important thing, that the ancient Israelites did not think that killing an animal got you out of sin. The death of the animal has nothing to do with it. The blood of the animal is important ritually, but the death of the animal has nothing to do with it. Most of the sacrifices in Leviticus do not involve death, do not involve blood. Sacrifice is not primarily about blood. It's primarily about relationship, building a relationship. And the animal's death does not do anything in Leviticus. Ancient Israel did not think the death of the animal mattered. What mattered was the meal. The meal matters. The meal is the thing that brings people together with God and with neighbor reconciliation. That's what mattered. So in other ancient cultures, they thought the death of the animal is important. So why am I saying this? Because for Christians, when we talk about the death of Jesus, God wanted to kill Jesus because I was supposed to die. We actually don't see that in the Old Testament or the New. That is to say, this is a really, really important point that liturgy does not save you. But that doesn't mean it's bad. I think it's good. But it's good in the sense that it helps you to say things that you don't know that you need to say. I don't know. Does that help? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brennan. I think Kayla kind of hinted at this, that I think you've helped us all take the Bible more seriously. And by taking it more seriously, have really learned a lot from it and are growing in our faith. So I thank everybody for being here. I can tell that our time is coming to an end because our kids are running in trying to get some goldfish, which is great.
Yeah.
I just want to point you in the direction of 3 things coming up. First, this is a series that we have every Sunday. Brennan's, of course, with us every 3rd Sunday. We have some great opportunities coming up. Next Sunday on the 27th, we have Dr. Doug Otati. Some of you might remember him from our convocation series in 2023. He was very well received, and he's a theologian at Davidson College. He'll be here. And then the following week, right before the election, we're bringing Dr. Ellen Ott Marshall here from Candler School of Theology. She's a specialist in Christian conflict, and she's going to talk to us about responding peacefully to the election. So I really strongly encourage you to participate in that. The last thing I want to note is that I can sense this desire to continue to learn from Brennan, which I'm so grateful for. So I invite you to continue conversation with him now, but also note that Mary Kate and I are working on a fun series with him, hopefully at Autopour. So we're going to bring Bible and beer together, and those always mix well. And we'll be able to talk a little bit more in depth with Brennan. So look out for some more information about that. But congratulations on submitting your book. We are so glad to have you here. And I'll ask you to just thank Brennan for being here one more time. And then that's all.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all. And I'll close this in prayer. Gracious God, thank you for bringing us together here. Thank you for opening up your word for us. Pray that you would be real to us. We pray that we would talk to you, even if it seems silly or strange or unusual, and that we would in some way hear you and feel you respond. Help us to love you with our whole hearts, our whole selves, our whole minds. Help us to love you with all of our might. And help us to be real and honest with you, to speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. Amen. Thanks.